Some men go years without hearing their own voice, and Elias Vane was one of them. When your heart breaks so completely that words feel pointless, silence becomes your closest companion. For 3 years, this giant cowboy lived alone on his dying ranch in Dust Creek, Texas. He talked only to his mule and drank away the memories of better days. At 6'7", most folks crossed the street when they saw him coming. Then one stormy night, he found her sleeping in his barn. Clara Bell was a schoolteacher on the run, carrying nothing but books and secrets. She was educated, stubborn, and running from something dark. When their eyes met in the lamplight, something stirred in Elias that he thought was gone forever. Two broken people discovering they might need each other. What happens when love finds you in the last place you expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Elias Vane heard the sound that would change everything, the soft rustle of hay in his barn that wasn't caused by wind or mice. He stood in the doorway of his weathered ranch house, holding a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows across the muddy yard. At 45, Elias had grown accustomed to the sounds of his solitude, the creak of old wood settling, the distant lowing of his few remaining cattle, and the steady breathing of Jeremiah, his mule, who had become his most faithful companion in a world that seemed determined to forget him. The Vane Ranch had once been the pride of Dust Creek, a sprawling testament to 3 generations of hard work and careful planning. Elias's grandfather had claimed this land in 1847, building the first log cabin with his own hands and gradually expanding it into the substantial ranch house that now stood like a monument to better times. His father had added the large barn, the corral, and the irrigation system that had made their cattle operation one of the most successful in this part of Texas. But drought and debt had a way of humbling even the proudest men. The Great Drought of 1881 had lasted 2 brutal years, killing half the herd and drying up the creek that gave the town its name. Then came Margaret's fever in the winter of 1883, and with her death, Elias lost not just his beloved wife, but his will to fight the mounting debts and failing land. The bank in Millbrook held the mortgage now, and every month brought another letter demanding payment he couldn't make. Margaret's wedding ring sat in a small wooden box on his dresser, the gold band catching what little light filtered through the dusty windows. He couldn't bear to look at it most days, but he couldn't bring himself to put it away either. It was all he had left of the woman who had made him believe in forever, who had laughed at his quiet jokes and fallen asleep in his arms every night for 12 beautiful years. Some evenings, when the whiskey made him brave enough, he would take the ring from its box and remember what it felt like to be loved completely. The morning routine had become a ritual of survival rather than living, coffee black and strong enough to wake the dead, a few words to Jeremiah while filling the water trough, a check on the remaining cattle, counting heads to make sure none had wandered off or fallen prey to coyotes. Then the long, empty hours until nightfall brought the mercy of sleep. Dust Creek itself was dying as surely as his ranch. What had once been a thriving community of nearly 300 souls had dwindled to fewer than 60. The general store still operated, barely, run by old Henrik Jansen, who extended credit he couldn't afford to neighbors who couldn't pay. The saloon closed most weeknights for lack of customers. The church held services every other Sunday instead of weekly, when the circuit preacher could make the journey from Millbrook. Doc Henley still maintained his practice, though at 73 he spent more time tending to the elderly and infirm than delivering babies or setting broken bones. There was talk that he might retire soon, which would leave the nearest medical care 60 miles away in Millbrook. Sheriff Morrison split his time between Dust Creek and 2 other failing townships, making his rounds when he could, but acknowledging that law and order had become largely theoretical concepts in these forgotten corners of Texas. The one bright spot in the community was Widow Prescott, a formidable woman of 60 who had lost her husband to a rattlesnake bite 5 years earlier and had since appointed herself the unofficial mayor, judge, and moral conscience of Dust Creek. She ran the boarding house, organized what little social life remained, and had a remarkable talent for knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. If anyone in town was going to take an interest in the mysterious woman sleeping in Elias's barn, it would be Widow Prescott. Elias approached the barn with the careful steps of a man who had learned to expect disappointment. The lantern light revealed the familiar scene: feed sacks stacked against one wall, his father's old plough gathering dust in the corner, and Jeremiah's stall where the faithful mule stood watching him with patient brown eyes. But there, in the hayloft above, he saw something that made his breath catch. A small, still form curled among the loose hay, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. She was sleeping so peacefully that for a moment Elias wondered if he was seeing things. 3 years of talking only to Jeremiah and the occasional visitor to his property had left him questioning his own perceptions sometimes. But as he climbed the wooden ladder, lantern held carefully in one hand, he could see that she was a young woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair escaping from a simple bun and clothes that spoke of education and refinement, even travel-worn as they were. A leather satchel lay beside her, and from it spilled the unmistakable shapes of books and papers. This was no ordinary drifter seeking shelter from the storm. This was someone with learning, someone who had known a different kind of life before whatever circumstances brought her to sleep in a stranger's barn. The sound of his throat clearing was enough. Her eyes opened not with the startled panic he might have expected, but with the careful awareness of someone who had learned to wake quietly and assess danger quickly. They were remarkable eyes, he noticed, a deep brown that seemed to hold intelligence and sadness in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of an educated woman. "I didn't mean to trespass. The storm was so fierce, and your barn looked empty." Elias found himself nodding before he remembered to speak. It's all right, miss. Storm like this, a person needs shelter." She sat up slowly, brushing hay from her dark blue traveling dress, and Elias could see that beneath her composed exterior she was exhausted. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just one sleepless night, and when she moved, he caught a glimpse of what looked like a healing bruise on her wrist. "I'm Clara Bell," she said, extending her hand with a dignity that seemed natural to her, even in these circumstances. "I'm a schoolteacher. I was, until recently." "Elias Vane," he replied, taking her hand gently. Her fingers were small and soft, but he could feel calluses that suggested she was no stranger to work. "This is my ranch. What's left of it, anyway?" Clara looked around the barn with an appraising eye, and Elias found himself seeing it through her perspective, the solid construction that had weathered decades of Texas storms, the good bones of a once thriving operation, the potential that still existed beneath the accumulated dust and neglect. "It's a good barn," she said simply, "built to last." Something in her tone suggested she knew about things built to last, and about things that fell apart despite all efforts to hold them together. Elias felt an unexpected kinship with this stranger who had sought shelter in his hay. "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes," he heard himself saying, the words coming easier than they had in years. "The house has a spare room. It's not much, but it's dry and warm." Clara studied his face in the lantern light, and Elias had the distinct impression she was weighing more than just his offer of shelter. She was evaluating him, trying to determine if he could be trusted, if this unexpected kindness came with expectations or dangers she couldn't afford. "That's very generous, Mr. Vane," she said finally, "but I wouldn't want to impose. The barn is perfectly—" "No woman sleeps in my barn while my house has empty rooms," Elias said, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. It was the first time in 3 years he had spoken with any kind of authority, and it surprised them both. Clara nodded slowly. "Then I accept your offer, with gratitude." The house felt different with another person in it. Margaret's presence had lingered for months after her death, in the scent of lavender she had loved, and the way she had arranged the furniture, and the 100 small touches that made a house a home. But time had gradually erased those traces, leaving behind only the echo of loneliness and the accumulating dust of a man who had stopped caring about such things. Now, as Clara looked around the front room with its stone fireplace and handmade furniture, Elias saw it fresh, again saw both its neglect and its possibilities. "You built this yourself?" Clara asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of a table Elias's father had crafted from oak. "My father and grandfather did most of it. I just tried to keep it standing." "They built it well," she said, and again there was that note in her voice that suggested she understood the difference between things that endured and things that crumbled. Elias showed her to the spare room, Margaret's old sewing room that had become a repository for boxes and forgotten belongings. It had a narrow bed and a washstand, and a window that looked out over what had once been Margaret's garden. "I'll get you some blankets," he said, "and there's a pitcher and basin if you'd like to wash up." "It's perfect," Clara said simply, "more than I had any right to expect." As Elias rummaged through the linen closet for clean blankets, he found himself moving with more purpose than he had felt in months. Having someone to care for, even temporarily, awakened something in him that he had thought died with Margaret. It wasn't romantic, not yet, anyway, but it was the simple human satisfaction of offering shelter and comfort to someone who needed it. When he returned with the blankets, Clara was standing at the window, looking out at the storm-lashed landscape. In her traveling dress, with her hair slightly mussed from sleep and her intelligent eyes taking in everything around her, she looked like someone who had stories to tell and secrets to keep. "How long has it been like this?" she asked. "The drought, I mean. The land looks like it's been thirsty for years." "Going on 4 years now," Elias replied, setting the blankets on the bed. "Some places got rain, but not here. Not enough, anyway. But you stayed." It wasn't a question, exactly, but Elias felt compelled to answer. "This is my home. My family's buried here. A man doesn't just walk away from that." Clara turned from the window, and in the lamplight, Elias could see something in her expression that he recognized the look of someone who understood the weight of loyalty and the cost of leaving everything behind. "No," she said quietly. "Sometimes he doesn't." The next morning brought weak sunlight filtering through breaking clouds. Elias woke earlier than usual, driven by the unfamiliar awareness that he was no longer alone in the house. He made coffee for 2, a simple act that felt momentous after 3 years of solitary mornings. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway as he was setting out 2 cups, her hair neatly arranged and her dress straightened as much as travel would allow. In the morning light, he could see more clearly the signs of her recent struggles, the shadows under her eyes, the careful way she moved, the way her gaze constantly shifted to windows and doorways as if checking for escape routes. "Good morning, Mr. Vane," she said, accepting the coffee cup with both hands. "I hope I'm not putting you to any trouble." "None at all," he replied, and found that he meant it. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks, actually. There's something to be said for solid walls and a real bed." They drank their coffee in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the kitchen window, the landscape looked washed clean by the storm, though the underlying drought damage was still evident in the brown grass and sparse vegetation. "I should be moving on today," Clara said eventually. "I've already imposed on your kindness more than I should have." "Where will you go?" Elias asked, surprised by how much the thought of her leaving bothered him. Clara hesitated, staring into her coffee cup. "I'm not entirely sure. West, I suppose. Maybe California. I hear there are opportunities for teachers there." "It's a long way to California," Elias observed. "Expensive too, and dangerous for a woman traveling alone." "I'm aware of the risks," Clara said. But there was something in her voice that suggested she was more aware of the dangers behind her than those ahead. It was then that Elias made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Later, he would wonder what prompted him to speak, whether it was loneliness or genuine concern for her welfare, or simply the recognition of a kindred spirit who had also known loss and disappointment. "You could stay," he said quietly, "for a while anyway, until you figure out where you're heading." Clara looked up sharply, studying his face with those intelligent brown eyes. "Mr. Vane, I appreciate your kindness, but I couldn't possibly—" "The town needs a teacher," he continued, the words coming more easily now that he had started. "The school closed 2 years ago when the last teacher left. There are still children here who need educating. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be honest work." "I don't have any credentials with me," Clara said slowly. "No references, no—" "Doc Henley serves on what's left of the school board, along with Widow Prescott and Henrik Jansen. They care more about whether you can teach than about paperwork." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Elias could almost see her weighing her options, the uncertain dangers of the road ahead, against the unknown risks of staying in a place where people might ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Would there be somewhere for me to live?" she asked finally. "I mean, I couldn't continue to impose on your hospitality indefinitely. Widow Prescott runs a boarding house. She's particular about her tenants, but she's fair, and she's been saying for months that the town needs new blood." As if summoned by the mention of her name, the sound of approaching horses could be heard from the front yard. Elias looked out the window to see a small delegation approaching, Doc Henley in his buggy, Widow Prescott riding side saddle on her grey mare, and Sheriff Morrison on his bay gelding. "Word travels fast in a small town," Elias said with a wry smile. "Looks like you're about to meet the welcoming committee." Clara stood and smoothed her skirts, and Elias noticed that she positioned herself where she could see both the front door and the back exit. Even in this moment of potential new beginning, she was prepared to run if necessary. The delegation dismounted and approached the porch with the purposeful air of people on official business. Doc Henley, a spare man with kind eyes and a white beard, knocked on the door with his walking stick. "Morning, Elias," he called out. "Heard you might have a visitor we should meet." And so began Clara Bell's introduction to the community of Dust Creek, a community that would soon discover they had found not just a teacher, but someone whose presence would remind them all that even in the hardest times, hope could take root in the most unlikely places. 3 days after Clara's arrival, Elias found her sitting at his kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, a crumpled letter in her hands, and her leather satchel open beside her. The morning light revealed what the lamplight had hidden, the full extent of the secrets she carried and the danger that had followed her to Dust Creek. "I have to leave," she said without looking up. "Today, I should never have stayed this long." Elias poured himself coffee and sat across from her, noting how her hands trembled as she tried to fold the letter. In the 3 days since the town delegation had visited, Clara had begun to settle into a routine that seemed to bring her peace. She had started helping with small tasks around the ranch, cooking meals that reminded Elias what it meant to share his table with another person, and in the evenings, she had begun to tell him stories about her life as a teacher, carefully edited stories that avoided certain subjects, but revealed her passion for learning and her genuine care for children. Now, whatever fragile security she had found was shattered. "What's in the letter, Clara?" he asked gently. She looked up, and he could see the war being fought behind her eyes, the desire to trust him battling against years of learned caution. Finally, she pushed the letter across the table toward him. "His name is Clayton Hartwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was my fiancée. The engagement was arranged by my father to settle some business debts. I tried to make the best of it, but Clayton," she touched her wrist where Elias had noticed the fading bruise, "he has very particular ideas about how a wife should behave." Elias read the letter with growing anger. Written in an educated hand on expensive paper, it was a masterpiece of veiled threats disguised as concern. Hartwell wrote that he was worried about Clara's welfare and had reason to believe she might be in the area. He mentioned his connections with local law enforcement and his determination to ensure her safe return to her family. "He's hired men to look for me," Clara continued. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Morrison, but someone at the post office in Millbrook must have told him about the inquiry. "He knows I'm here, or close to here." "What kind of business debts?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Clara's laugh was bitter. the kind that ambitious men create when they want to control something or someone. My father borrowed money from Hartwell's bank to expand his mercantile business. When the expansion failed, Clayton offered a generous solution to his daughter, and the debt would be forgiven. My father saw it as saving the family business. I saw it as being sold like livestock. So, you ran. The night before the wedding, Clayton had... She stopped, touching her cheek, where Elias now noticed the faint yellow remnant of another bruise. He made it clear what kind of marriage it would be. I couldn't go through with it. Elias felt something cold and hard settling in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the war. It was the same controlled fury that had carried him through battles against men who preyed on the innocent, the same protective instinct that had made him volunteer for the most dangerous missions rather than let his comrades face them alone. How much does your father owe him? $3,000. It might as well be $3 million for all the chance we have of paying it back. Elias was quiet for a moment, thinking. $3,000 was indeed a substantial sum, but not impossible for a man with connections and determination. More troubling was the power dynamic Hartwell had created using debt as a weapon to acquire what he wanted, knowing that few people had the resources to fight back. "There's something else," Clara said, pulling more papers from her satchel. "I took these when I left. I thought if I could prove he was dishonest in his business dealings, maybe I could find a way to break the engagement legally." The papers she showed him were copies of loan documents, correspondence, and what appeared to be records of foreclosures. Even with Elias's limited knowledge of finance, patterns began to emerge. Loans, offered at generous terms that became crushing when borrowers inevitably fell behind, properties acquired for far less than their value, families displaced, and businesses destroyed. He's done this before, Elias realized. Created situations where people have to give him what he wants or lose everything. Many times. The papers I took document at least a dozen similar arrangements over the past 5 years. Young women from families with financial difficulties, widows with valuable property, anyone vulnerable enough to be manipulated. And now he's coming here. Clara stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen like a caged animal. "Which is why I have to leave. I won't bring his kind of trouble to people who have been kind to me. You've all suffered enough without adding my problems to your burden." "Running won't solve this, Clara. Men like Hartwell don't give up easily. If he's gone to the trouble of tracking you this far, he'll keep looking until he finds you." "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, turning to face him with desperate eyes. "I have no money, no family support, no legal standing. He has wealth, connections, and the law on his side. An engagement is a legal contract, even if it was made under duress." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the land his family had worked for 3 generations. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together and the dreams that had died with her. He thought about the years of isolation and grief, the slow surrender to defeat that had characterized his existence since her death. Then he looked at Clara, intelligent, brave Clara, who had risked everything to escape a fate worse than poverty, who had found her way to his barn on the worst night of her journey, and somehow brought light back into his dark world. "Marry me," he said quietly. The words surprised them both. Clara stopped pacing and stared at him, as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, standing up to face her. "A married woman can't be compelled to honor an engagement to another man. It would give you legal protection and a legitimate reason to be here." "Elias, that's you can't possibly. I mean, we barely know each other." "We know enough. I know you're brave and kind and intelligent. I know you care about children and education and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. I know you make the best coffee I've tasted in 3 years, and that you don't flinch when you see the mistakes I've made with this ranch." Clara sat down heavily, staring at him with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been hope. "And what would you get out of such an arrangement?" she asked carefully. Elias considered the question seriously. "Company, purpose, a reason to fix up this place, instead of just letting it fall down around me. someone to talk to besides Jeremiah. It would be a marriage of convenience, you understand. After what I've been through with Clayton, I'm not ready for. I understand, Elias said gently. We'd take things as slow as you need. The important thing is keeping you safe. Clara was quiet for several minutes, and Elias could see her weighing the options. Marriage to a virtual stranger versus a lifetime of running from a man who would never stop hunting her. The security of a home and community against the risk of trusting someone new with her safety and her secrets. He'll come here, she said finally. When he discovers we're married, he'll come, and he won't come alone. Let him come. This is my land, and these are my neighbors. We've all survived droughts and hard times, and men who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. You don't understand what kind of man he is, Elias. He's not just wealthy. He has connections with politicians, judges, law enforcement. He could make life very difficult for everyone in Dust Creek. Then we'll face that when it happens. But we'll face it together, as a community. You're not alone in this anymore, Clara. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Morrison riding up alone this time, his expression grim. Elias noticed that Clara automatically moved to where she could see both exits, her body tense with the readiness to flee. Sheriff Morrison dismounted and approached the house with the heavy steps of a man carrying unwelcome news. He was a decent man, Elias knew, but one who understood the realities of politics and power in ways that sometimes conflicted with simple justice. "Morning, Elias," he said, tipping his hat as Elias opened the door. "Miss Bell, I'm afraid I need to have a word with both of you." They invited him in for coffee, but Morrison declined, choosing to stand near the door with his hat in his Hansard posture that suggested he wanted to be able to leave quickly if necessary. "I got another letter yesterday," he said without preamble, "from that banker fellow in Millbrook, Clayton Hartwell. He's offering a substantial reward for information about Miss Bell's whereabouts, and he's got papers that suggest she might be considered a fugitive." "What kind of papers?" Elias asked, though Clara had already gone pale. "Claims she stole property belonging to him, documents, personal items, things like that. Now, I'm not saying I believe everything I read, but the law is the law, and if he files formal charges—" "The documents were proof of his illegal business practices," Clara said quietly. "Evidence that he's been using fraudulent loans to force women into unwanted marriages." Morrison nodded slowly. "That may well be true, miss, but proving it would require lawyers and courts and time that might not be on your side. Hartwell's got resources and connections. He could make things very complicated for everyone involved." "What are you telling us, Sheriff?" Elias asked. "I'm telling you that you need to be careful, both of you. Men like Hartwell don't like to be defied, and they have ways of making their displeasure known. If Miss Bell is going to stay in this area, she needs legal protection that goes beyond just hiding out." Elias and Clara exchanged glances, and in that moment, Clara made her decision. "Mr. Vane has asked me to marry him," she said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was saying. "We were hoping you could arrange for the ceremony as soon as possible." Sheriff Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but he had been a lawman long enough to recognize the practical wisdom of the arrangement. "That would certainly complicate things for Mr. Hartwell," he said thoughtfully. "A married woman has different legal status than a single one. But you should know that he's not likely to give up easily. Marriage or no marriage, he's invested too much in this pursuit to walk away quietly." "We understand the risks," Elias said, "but running hasn't solved the problem, and hiding won't make it go away. Sometimes you have to make a stand." "All right then," Morrison said, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll talk to Doc Henley about organizing a ceremony. Under the circumstances, I'd suggest sooner rather than later. And Elias, you might want to think about what you'll do if Hartwell decides to pay a personal visit." After the sheriff left, Clara and Elias sat in their kitchen in the quiet that follows life-changing decisions. The morning light seemed different somehow, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked. "Once we're married, there's no going back. Hartwell will see it as a declaration of war." Then we'd better make sure we're ready to fight, Elias replied. And for the first time in 3 years, his voice carried the authority of a man who had found something worth protecting. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the drought-stricken land, and in the distance, storm clouds began to gather on the horizon. The wedding was set for 3 days hence, giving Clara barely enough time to let the reality of her decision settle in her mind. Word spread through Dust Creek with the efficiency that only small communities could achieve, and by evening, Widow Prescott had arrived at the ranch with a delegation of women carrying fabric, needles, and the determined air of people who had decided to make the best of an unusual situation. No woman gets married in a traveling dress, not while I have breath in my body, Widow Prescott declared, bustling into the house with her arms full of white cotton and ivory lace. We may not have much in this town, but we know how to properly celebrate the important moments. Clara found herself swept up in preparations she had never expected. Mrs. Henrik Jansen, the store owner's wife, brought ribbon and buttons salvaged from her own wedding dress 30 years earlier. Doc Henley's daughter Sarah, visiting from Dallas, contributed a delicate veil that had been in her family for 3 generations. Even the shy Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff's wife, appeared with a pair of white shoes that had never been worn. As the women worked around Clara's kitchen table, measuring and cutting and stitching with practiced efficiency, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warm embrace of community, the sense of belonging to something larger than her own struggles. These women barely knew her, but they had accepted her as one of their own and were determined to send her to the altar with dignity and joy. "You're doing the right thing, dear," Widow Prescott said, as she pinned the hem of the dress to the proper length. "Elias is a good man. Lost his way after Margaret died, as any man would, but he's got strong roots and a kind heart. He'll protect you." "It's not a love match," Clara said quietly, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to explain. "Love has many faces," Sarah Henley observed, threading her needle with careful precision. "Sometimes it arrives with lightning and thunder, and sometimes it grows quiet and steady like a tree putting down roots. Either way can make a good marriage, if both people are willing to tend it properly." The men, meanwhile, had their own preparations to make. Elias found himself the beneficiary of similar community care as Doc Henley and Henrik Jansen appeared at his door with a bottle of whiskey and the serious demeanor of men preparing to discuss weighty matters. "You sure about this, son?" Doc Henley asked as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over the drought-stricken landscape. "Marriage is serious business under the best of circumstances, and these circumstances are, well, they're complicated." "I'm sure," Elias replied, and found that he meant it more with each passing hour. The prospect of sharing his life with Clara, even under their unusual arrangement, had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Margaret's death. Not the same kind of love that would take time to develop, if it developed at all, but a sense of purpose and protectiveness that made him feel more like his old self than he had in years. "She's a fine woman," Henrik added, taking a careful sip of whiskey. "Educated, well-mannered, good with people, but this Hartwell fellow Sheriff Morrison showed me the letters. He's not going to take this marriage lying down." "I know. We'll deal with that when the time comes." "You got any idea what you're up against?" Doc Henley asked. Morrison did some checking. "Hartwell's not just wealthy, he's got connections with some powerful people. Politicians, judges, other bankers. He could make life very difficult for all of us if he sets his mind to it." Elias was quiet for a moment, thinking about the war and the men he had known who believed their wealth and connections made them untouchable. He had learned that such men often had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with patience and determination. "Men like that usually have secrets," he said finally, "things they don't want exposed to public scrutiny." Clara took some papers when she left, documents that show how he's been manipulating people. Maybe it's time someone took a closer look at Mr. Hartwell's business practices. The next morning brought the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Elias was working on repairing the broken plow that had become symbolic of his collaboration with Clara when he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Looking up, he saw a well-dressed man in his 50s driving a rented rig from the Millbrook livery stable. The man climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to physical labor, brushing dust from his expensive coat and looking around the ranch with obvious distaste. Everything about him, from his soft hands to his polished boots, marked him as a city man who rarely ventured into the rural world. "Mr. Vane," the man called out, approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Theodore Blackwood. I represent Mr. Clayton Hartwell's interests. I was hoping we could have a conversation about Miss Clara Bell." Elias set down his tools and straightened to his full height, noting how the man's confidence wavered slightly when confronted with his imposing physical presence. At 6'7", Elias had learned that sometimes sheer size could be more effective than words in establishing the terms of a conversation. "Miss Bell is inside," Elias said carefully, "but I'm not sure she wants to speak with anyone representing Mr. Hartwell." "Oh, I think she'll want to hear what I have to say," Blackwood replied, his smile becoming more predatory. "You see, Mr. Hartwell is prepared to be very generous in resolving this unfortunate misunderstanding. He's willing to forgive Miss Bell's, shall we say, temporary lapse in judgment and welcome her back with no questions asked. And if she prefers to stay here," Blackwood's expression hardened slightly, "that would be most unfortunate. You see, Miss Bell took certain property that belongs to Mr. Hartwell. Documents, personal items, things of significant value. Until those items are returned, she remains technically a fugitive from justice." It was at that moment that Clara appeared in the doorway of the house, having heard the voices. She wore one of Margaret's old dresses that Widow Prescott had altered to fit her, and her hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She looked calm and composed, but Elias could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes quickly assessed potential escape routes. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. "I wondered when Clayton would send someone." "Miss Bell," Blackwood replied, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "You look well. Mr. Hartwell has been quite worried about your welfare." "I'm sure he has. What does he want?" "Simply for you to return home and honor your commitments. The wedding can be rescheduled, your family's debts will be forgiven, and this entire unpleasant episode can be forgotten." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood's smile disappeared entirely. "Then Mr. Hartwell will be forced to pursue legal remedies. The theft charges, for instance, the breach of contract suit against your family, the foreclosure proceedings on your father's property. These things can be avoided with your cooperation. But Mr. Hartwell's patience is not unlimited." Clara stepped closer to Elias, and he could feel her trembling with anger rather than fear. The woman who had fled in terror from her engagement had found something in the past few days' courage, perhaps, or simply the support of people who believed in her right to choose her own destiny. "You can tell Mr. Hartwell that I will not be returning," she said firmly. "I will not be marrying him, and I will not be intimidated by his threats." "I see," Blackwood said, pulling out a small notebook and making a show of writing something down. "And what about you, Mr. Vane? Are you prepared for the consequences of harboring a fugitive?" "Miss Bell is not a fugitive," Elias replied calmly. "She's my fiancée. We're to be married tomorrow." Blackwood's eyebrows rose in surprise, though Elias suspected the man had already learned about the planned wedding through his own sources of information. "How convenient," he said with obvious skepticism. "A marriage of convenience to avoid legal obligations. I'm afraid the courts might take a dim view of such an arrangement. The courts might also take a dim view of a man who uses fraudulent loans to force women into unwanted marriages." Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "I have documentation of Mr. Hartwell's business practices, Mr. Blackwood, evidence of his systematic manipulation of vulnerable families." For the first time, Blackwood looked genuinely concerned. "I would be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove, Miss Bell. Slander is also a legal matter." "Then perhaps Mr. Hartwell should be more careful about creating evidence of his crimes," Clara replied. Blackwood closed his notebook with a sharp snap and adjusted his coat. "I can see that reasonable discourse is impossible here. I'll be returning to Millbrook to report to Mr. Hartwell." I trust you'll both consider the wisdom of reconsidering your positions before this matter escalates further." After he left, Elias and Clara stood in their yard, watching the dust cloud from his wagon disappear toward town. The visit had clarified something important. Hartwell was not going to give up easily, and he was prepared to use every legal and financial weapon at his disposal to get what he wanted. "Are you having second thoughts?" Clara asked quietly. "Are you?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but not of marrying you. I'm terrified of what Clayton might do to innocent people because of me." "Then we make sure we're ready for whatever he tries," Elias said, "and we make sure our friends and neighbors understand what they might be facing." That evening, they walked together to town for what amounted to a community meeting at Widow Prescott's boarding house. Word of Blackwood's visit had spread with typical small-town efficiency, and the main parlor was crowded with most of Dust Creek's adult population. Sheriff Morrison spoke first, explaining what he knew about Hartwell's legal threats and the potential consequences for anyone who supported Clara's decision to stay. Doc Henley outlined the economic pressures that Hartwell might bring to bear: foreclosures, called loans, business disruptions that could devastate families already struggling with drought and hard times. "So what you're saying," Henrik Janssen observed, with characteristic bluntness, "is that we can either abandon Clara to this bastard, pardon my French, ladies, or we can all risk losing everything we've worked for." "That's about the size of it," Morrison confirmed grimly. The room was quiet for several minutes as people considered the implications. These were not wealthy people who could afford to take risks with their livelihoods. They were farmers and shopkeepers and working families who had already sacrificed much to the drought and economic hardship. It was Widow Prescott who broke the silence. "I buried 2 husbands in this town," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived multiple tragedies. "I've seen what happens when good people stand by and let bullies have their way. It doesn't stop with just one victim, it gets worse, and it spreads until everyone is living in fear. Margaret would have wanted us to help," Doc Henley added quietly, and Elias felt his throat tighten at the mention of his late wife's name. "She always said a community was only as strong as its willingness to protect the most vulnerable." One by one, the other residents began to speak. Sarah Morrison talked about the importance of having a teacher for the children. Henrik Janssen mentioned that business had actually improved slightly since Clara's arrival, as people began to have hope for the town's future again. Even quiet Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith, said he was tired of letting rich men from other places dictate what happened in Dust Creek. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the community had made its choice. They would stand with Clara and Elias, whatever the cost. As they walked home under a star-filled sky, Clara slipped her hand into Elias's, the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For giving me something worth fighting for." The morning of their wedding dawned clear and warm, with the first hints of autumn threading through the late summer air. Elias woke before sunrise, as had become his habit. But instead of the familiar weight of loneliness that usually accompanied his mornings, he felt something lighter: anticipation, perhaps, or simply the novelty of knowing that today would fundamentally change his life. He made coffee for 2, the ritual that had become precious to him over the past week. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway just as he was setting out the cups, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 people about to make promises they hoped they could keep, entering into a partnership that was both practical necessity and leap of faith. "Good morning, Mrs. Vane," Elias said gently, testing the sound of her new name. "Good morning, Mr. Vane," she replied, and there was something in her smile that suggested she didn't find the prospect entirely daunting. "Are you ready for this?" "I think so. Are you?" Clara accepted her coffee cup and moved to stand beside him at the kitchen window, looking out over the land that would soon legally be her home as well as his. The drought damage was still evident, but there were signs of recovery: 2 green shoots where they had begun working together to repair the irrigation system, a vegetable garden that was producing its first small harvest, the sense that someone was caring for the place again. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," she said, "about this being a marriage of convenience. I want you to know that even though our arrangement began that way, I don't intend to approach it carelessly. If I'm going to be your wife, I want to be a good one. And I want to be a good husband," Elias replied, "even if we're still figuring out what that means for us." They had established a morning routine over the past week that felt natural despite its newness. Clara would help with the morning chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, milking the cow that Henrik Jansson had generously donated to help them get established. Elias would tend to the livestock and check the water systems they had been working to repair. Then they would meet back at the house for breakfast and the kind of conversation that had become increasingly easy between them. Clara was an excellent cook, he had discovered, with a talent for making simple ingredients into satisfying meals. More than that, she was good company, intelligent enough to discuss books and ideas, practical enough to understand the challenges of ranch life, and possessed of a dry humor that had surprised him with its ability to make him laugh. "I've been thinking about the school," Clara said as they shared their breakfast. "If the town is serious about reopening it, we'll need more than just good intentions. There will be supplies to buy, curriculum to plan, parents to convince that education is worth the time and expense." Doc Henley mentioned that the old schoolhouse is still in decent shape. "Might need some cleaning and repairs, but the bones are solid. I'd like to see it today, after we're married. I want to understand what we're working with." The easy way, she said, "we," did something warm and unexpected to Elias's chest. It had been 3 years since anyone had automatically included him in their plans, since he had been part of something larger than his own daily survival. By mid-morning, Widow Prescott arrived with the finished wedding dress and a small army of women determined to ensure that Clara looked her best. Elias found himself banished from his own house while they worked their magic, so he spent the time with Doc Henley and Henrik Jansson, making final preparations for the ceremony. The wedding would be held in the main room of Widow Prescott's boarding house, which served as the unofficial community center for occasions that required more space than most homes could provide. It wasn't grand by city standards, but it would be filled with the warmth of people who had chosen to stand with them despite the risks. "You nervous?" Doc Henley asked as they arranged chairs and hung the modest decorations that Sarah Morrison had created from wildflowers and ribbon. "Some," Elias admitted. "It's been a long time since I stood up in front of people and made promises." "Margaret would have liked her," Henrik observed, and Elias realized it was true. Margaret had possessed the same combination of intelligence and practical kindness that he recognized in Clara, the same willingness to work hard for the things that mattered. "I think she would have," he agreed. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. Clara walked down the makeshift aisle in her white cotton dress, the community veil framing her face and making her look younger and more vulnerable than usual. But when she reached Elias's side and looked up at him, there was nothing uncertain in her expressionally quiet determination and something that might have been trust. Doc Henley, who had been ordained years earlier when the town couldn't afford a regular minister, performed the service with dignity and warmth. The words were traditional, but they seemed to carry extra weight under the circumstances, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. These were people who understood that such promises were not made lightly. When Doc Henley pronounced them husband and wife, Elias kissed Clara with gentle respect, and she responded with a warmth that surprised them both. The community erupted in applause and congratulations, and for a moment, the weight of their complicated circumstances lifted, replaced by the simple joy of celebration. The reception was held in the same room, with food contributed by every family in town despite their modest means. There was music provided by Tom Fletcher on his fiddle and Mrs. Jansson on her husband's accordion. There was dancing, including a waltz between the new bride and groom, that reminded everyone present why weddings were worth celebrating, even in difficult times. As the afternoon wore on, Elias found himself watching Clara move through the crowd, accepting congratulations and settling into her new role as a member of the community. She had a natural grace with people, he noticed, a way of making everyone feel heard and valued that would serve her well as a teacher. "She's good for you," Widow Prescott observed, appearing at his elbow with a cup of punch. "I can see it in the way you stand, the way you smile. You're coming back to life, Elias Vane." "It's early days yet," he replied, but he knew what she meant. The constant weight of grief and isolation that had pressed down on him for 3 years had begun to lift, not entirely, but enough to let him remember what it felt like to hope for the future. Maybe so, but hope has to start somewhere. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Elias and Clara found themselves walking back to their ranch, their home under a sky full of stars. Clara had changed out of her wedding dress into one of Margaret's practical day dresses, and she carried her shoes in her hand, having kicked them off to dance more freely. "That was lovely," she said, tucking her hand into his arm. "I haven't felt so welcomed anywhere in a very long time." "They're good people. They'll stand by us when things get difficult." "And they will get difficult, won't they? Clayton won't give up easily." Elias was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell her about his own preparations. Over the past few days, he had been quietly putting measures in place, checking his weapons, reinforcing the house's defenses, making arrangements with neighbors for mutual support if trouble came calling. "Probably," he said finally, "but we're not the same people we were a week ago. We're not alone anymore." Back at the house, they faced the practical realities of their new living arrangement. They had discussed it beforehand. Clara would continue to use the spare room until and unless she chose otherwise. It was an arrangement that respected her need for safety and autonomy, while acknowledging that their marriage, however practical its origins, might grow into something deeper given time. "Thank you," Clara said as they stood somewhat awkwardly in the front room of their shared home. "For everything you've done, everything you've risked. I know this isn't what you planned for your life." "Plans change," Elias replied, "sometimes for the better." She smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "I'm going to do my best to make sure this one changes for the better." Over the following days, they settled into the rhythm of married life with surprising ease. Clara threw herself into the work of establishing the school, spending long hours in the abandoned schoolhouse, cleaning, organizing, and making lists of needed supplies. Elias continued his work on the ranch, but now he had helped Clara prove surprisingly capable with livestock and showed a real aptitude for the problem-solving that ranch life required. Their evening conversations became a cherished part of the day. After supper, they would sit on the front porch and talk about their plans for the school, their hopes for the ranch, their memories of better times. Clara gradually shared more about her life before Hartweller education at a women's seminary, her love of literature and learning, her dreams of making a difference in children's lives. Elias found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing stories about Margaret, about his time in the war, about the history of his family's land. Clara listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that helped him see familiar stories in new ways. "You were happy with her?" Clara observed one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "With Margaret, I mean. I can hear it in your voice when you talk about her." "I was," Elias replied simply. "For 12 years, I knew exactly what my life was supposed to be. Then she died, and I lost my way for a while. And now," he considered the question carefully, "now I'm finding a different way. Not the same as before, but maybe that's all right." Clara nodded, understanding implicit in her silence. They were both learning that healing didn't mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't require abandoning the past. The morning coffee ritual had evolved into something sacred between them. Each dawn, they would meet in the kitchen and share the quiet minutes before the day's demands took hold. Clara would tell him about her plans for the school, her ideas for lessons and activities. Elias would share his thoughts about the ranch, the repairs that needed attention, the small signs of recovery he noticed in the land. "I received a letter yesterday," Clara said one morning, her tone carefully neutral, "from my father." Elias felt his muscles tense automatically, Any communication from Clara's past carried the potential for trouble. What did he say? That he's received several visits from Clayton's representatives, that the pressure is increasing. He wanted to know if I was safe, if I had found somewhere Toto make a life. What will you tell him? Clara was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee cup. The truth, that I'm married to a good man, that I'm building something worthwhile here, that I'm finally free to make my own choices. He'll worry about the consequences. Yes, but he'll also understand. My father may have made mistakes, but he loves me. He wants me to be happy more than he wants to be free of debt. That afternoon, Clara took Elias to see the schoolhouse for the first time. It was a simple building, constructed of local stone with large windows to let in natural light. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that slanted through the glass, and the wooden floors creaked pleasantly underfoot. It has good bones, Clara said, echoing his assessment of the ranch. The desks are still here, and most of the books survived. I think with some cleaning and basic repairs, we could have classes starting within a month. Elias walked around the room, noting what needed to be fixed. Loose floorboard here, a cracked window there, the pot-bellied stove that would need attention before winter arrived. I can handle the repairs, he said, and Henrik mentioned he might be able to donate some supplies. The children will need books, paper, pencils, basic things that most people take for granted. We'll find a way. Communities have managed worse with less. Clara moved to stand beside him at one of the large windows, looking out over the town that was slowly becoming their home. Do you think we can really make this work, Elias? The school, I mean, but also everything else. I think we have to try. These children deserve a chance at education, at something better than just surviving from one season to the next. And us? Do we deserve a chance at something better? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore fully. But Elias found himself reaching for her hand, and Clara didn't pull away. I think so, he said quietly. I think maybe we both deserve that chance. That evening brought another visitor, Sheriff Morrison, arriving just as they were finishing supper. His expression was grim, and he declined their offer of coffee. I'm afraid I have some troubling news, he said without preamble. I had word today from colleagues in other counties. Hartwell's been asking questions, offering rewards for information. He's also been calling in debts and putting pressure on people who might be inclined to help you. What kind of pressure? Clara asked. The economic kind. Foreclosures, called loans, business disruptions. He's making it clear that supporting you could be expensive. Elias felt the familiar cold anger settling in his chest. How many people has he hurt? Hard to say for certain, but it's more than just threats. The Kellys lost their farm last week mortgage, suddenly came due with no possibility of extension. The Hendersons had to close their store when their suppliers mysteriously stopped extending credit. Clara had gone pale. Because of me. Because they helped me. Because of him, Morrison corrected firmly. Because he's a bully who thinks money gives him the right to destroy people's lives. What can we do? Elias asked. Morrison was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with something. Officially, nothing. He's staying within the bounds of the law, technically speaking. Unofficially, well, that's a different conversation. Then let's have the unofficial conversation. Those papers, Clara took the evidence of his other schemes. If someone were to make sure they reached the right authorities, it might shift the balance of power considerably. What kind of authorities? Federal marshals, for one. Banking fraud crosses state lines, which makes it a federal matter. There are also newspaper editors who might be interested in a story about corruption in small-town banking. Clara looked between the two men, understanding dawning in her expression. You're talking about fighting back. I'm talking about evening the odds, Morrison replied. Hartwell's been using information as a weapon. Maybe it's time someone turned that weapon against him. The following Sunday, Clara insisted they visit Margaret's grave together. It was something Elias had avoided suggesting, unsure whether it would be appropriate or painful for his new wife to pay respects to his deceased one. But Clara had mentioned it herself over breakfast, saying she felt it was important to acknowledge the woman who had come before her. The cemetery sat on a small hill overlooking the town, shaded by ancient oak trees that had somehow survived the drought that claimed so much else. Margaret's headstone was simple granite, carved with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved wife and daughter of Dust Creek." Wildflowers had grown up around it, not planted by any human hand, but seeded by wind and weather into a natural memorial. Clara had brought a small bouquet of late summer flowers she had gathered from the recovering garden behind their house. She placed them carefully at the base of the headstone, then stepped back to stand beside Elias in respectful silence. "She was beautiful," Clara said finally, studying the small photograph that had been embedded in the stony practice that was becoming more common as photography became more accessible. "Inside and out," Elias replied. "She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, of finding the good in difficult situations. Tell me about how you met." Elias smiled at the memory. "Church social, 1870. She was visiting her cousin from back east, wearing a yellow dress that caught every eye in the room. But when I worked up the courage to ask her to dance, she turned me down flat." "She turned you down?" "Said she didn't dance with men who were too proud to ask properly. I had just walked over and grunted something about dancing, like I was doing her a favor." He chuckled at his younger self's arrogance. "Made me come back the next week with a proper introduction and a real invitation. And then she danced with you?" "3 dances. By the end of the evening, I knew I was going to marry her. Took me 6 months to convince her of the same thing." Clara was quiet for several minutes, and Elias could sense her working through something important. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "I need you to know that I don't expect to replace her in your heart. I don't want to try. What you had with Margaret was precious, and it should stay precious. But I hope there might be room for something different, something that honors what came before without trying to recreate it." The words hit Elias with unexpected force. He had been struggling with guilt about allowing himself to care for Clara, as if happiness with his new wife somehow betrayed his love for his first one. But Clara's gentle wisdom offered him permission to feel both grief for what he had lost and hope for what he might yet find. "Margaret would have liked you," he said quietly. "She would have appreciated your kindness, your intelligence. She would have wanted me to be happy. Then maybe we're on the right path." As they walked back toward town, Clara slipped her hand into the gesture, becoming more natural each time she did it. They passed the schoolhouse, where Elias had spent the morning making repairs, and Clara pointed out the improvements she envisioned. "I've been thinking about curriculum," she said, "not just basic reading and arithmetic, but practical skills the children will need. Agriculture, basic medicine, household management for the girls, mechanical skills for the boys." Sounds ambitious. These children are growing up in a hard world. They need to be prepared for it, but they also need to know there are possibilities beyond just survival. They were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Young Tommy Prescott, Widow Prescott's grandson, came racing toward them with the urgent energy of a 10-year-old bearing important news. "Mr. and Mrs. Vane," he called out, skidding to a stop before them. "Grandma says to come quick. There's strangers in town, and they're asking questions about you." Elias felt his body tense automatically, the old military instincts awakening. "What kind of strangers, Tommy?" "City men. Fancy clothes and mean faces. They went to the boarding house first, then to the store, then to the sheriff's office. Grandma says they look like trouble." Clara's hand tightened on Elias's arm, but her voice remained steady. "Did they say what they wanted?" "Just asking questions about the new school teacher and where she's staying, and if anyone's seen papers or documents that don't belong to her." Elias and Clara exchanged glances. They had known this moment would come eventually, but the reality of it still sent a chill through both of them. "Tommy, you run home and tell your grandmother that we'll be along shortly. And Tommy," Elias's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "you keep yourself inside until these strangers leave town, understand?" The boy nodded solemnly and raced back toward the boarding house. Elias turned to Clara, studying her face for signs of panic or the desire to flee. Instead, he saw the same quiet determination that had first attracted him to her. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be. They can ask all the questions they want, but they won't find anything here they can use against us. The papers you took from Hartwell, where are they now?" Clara smiled grimly. "Somewhere very safe. Somewhere that if anything happens to me, they'll automatically be delivered to people who can make good use of them." They walked toward town with measured steps, two people who had made their choice and were prepared to face the consequences. As they approached the main street, they could see a small crowd gathered outside the boarding house, not the curious crowd that might form around welcome visitors, but the wary, protective crowd that appeared when a community sensed threat. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the boarding house as they approached, his expression carefully neutral, but his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Behind him came two men who were clearly not locals, well-dressed, well-fed, with the soft look of people who solved their problems with money rather than work. The older of the two men stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and the kind of expensive clothes that were meant to impress people in small towns. "Mrs. Vane, I presume?" he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My name is Jacob Thornfield. I represent certain business interests that have been concerned about your welfare." "My welfare is perfectly fine, thank you," Clara replied coolly. "As you can see, I'm well cared for, and exactly where I choose to be." "Yes, we heard about your recent marriage. Quite sudden, wasn't it? One might almost think it was arranged for purposes other than romance." Elias stepped slightly forward, not threateningly, but enough to remind Thornfield that Clara was not alone and unprotected. "My wife's reasons for marrying me are her own business," he said quietly, just as her decision to leave Millbrook was her own choice. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Mr. Vane. You see, Miss Bell, excuse me, Mrs. Van took certain property that doesn't belong to her when she left. Until that property is returned, she remains in violation of the law." "What property?" Sheriff Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be unsatisfactory. "Documents, personal correspondence, items of sentimental and financial value. The specific details are confidential, but I assure you, the legal standing is quite clear." It was Clara who responded, her voice carrying the authority of an educated woman who would not be intimidated by vague legal threats. "If Mr. Hartwell believes I have stolen something from him, he's welcome to file formal charges and present evidence to support his claim. Until then, I suggest you stop harassing innocent people with your fishing expedition." Thornfield's smile became less pleasant. "Mrs. Vane, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. Mr. Hartwell has resources at his disposal that extend far beyond this little town. He can make life very difficult for anyone who chooses to oppose him. And I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation." Widow Prescott's voice rang out from the boarding house porch. "This is a respectable community, and we don't take kindly to strangers who come here making threats against our neighbors." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Elias noticed that it included most of the town's adult population, and several of the men had positioned themselves in ways that suggested they were prepared for trouble if it came. Doc Henley stepped forward, his medical bag in his hand, and his expression stern. "I've been this town's doctor for 40 years, and I've seen what happens when communities turn their backs on people who need help. We're not going to do that here. Neither are we going to stand by while outsiders try to intimidate decent folks," Henrik Jansen added, emerging from his store with Tom Fletcher the blacksmith beside him. Thornfield looked around the crowd with growing unease. Whatever he had expected to find in Dust Creek, it wasn't this level of organized community support. "I can see that reasonable discussion is impossible here," he said finally. "But this matter is far from over. Mr. Hartwell is not a man who gives up easily, and he has legal remedies available that extend far beyond this jurisdiction. Then let him pursue them through proper channels. Sheriff Morrison said firmly. "Until he does, I suggest you gentlemen continue on your way. Dust Creek doesn't have much to offer visitors, and I'd hate for you to be disappointed." After the men left, the crowd gradually dispersed, but not before several people made a point of speaking to Clara and Elias, offering support and reassurance. The message was clear: whatever came next, they would not face it alone. That evening, as they sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Clara and Elias talked quietly about what the visit meant and what they should expect next. "They were testing us," Clara observed, "seeing how united the community is, how determined we are to resist pressure." "And what did they learn?" "That we're not going to be easily intimidated, but also that Hartwell's reach extends further than we hoped. Those men weren't local law enforcement, they were private investigators, maybe worse." Elias was quiet for a moment, thinking about the war and the different kinds of battles he had fought. Some were won with superior firepower, others with better strategy, still others with simple determination to outlast the enemy. "We need to be smarter about this," he said finally, "more strategic. If Hartwell wants to play games with threats and intimidation, maybe it's time we started playing our own game." "What did you have in mind?" "Those papers you took, it's time to put them to use, not just as insurance, but as weapons. If we're going to fight this battle, we might as well fight it to win." Clara nodded slowly, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready for what comes next." The relationship between Elias and Clara had been growing deeper with each passing day, but it was the night after Thornfield's visit that something fundamental shifted between them. The threat from Hartwell's men had reminded them both how precarious their situation was, how much they had to lose if they failed to protect what they were building together. Clara had been quieter than usual during supper, lost in thought as she picked at her food. When Elias asked if she was all right, she looked up with eyes that held a mixture of fear and determination. "I keep thinking about what that man said," she admitted, "about Hartwell's resources, his reach. What if we're not strong enough to fight him? What if by staying here, I'm putting everyone in danger?" Elias reached across the table to take her hand, noting how cold her fingers were despite the warm evening. "You're not putting anyone in danger," he said firmly. "Hartwell is. And as for not being strong enough, well, I've seen what you're capable of. You walked away from a life of luxury rather than submit to a man who would have destroyed your spirit. You've helped me remember what it means to hope for something better. Don't underestimate your own strength." That night, for the first time since their marriage, Clara came to him, not with passion, but with the simple human need for comfort and connection in the face of uncertainty. She appeared in his bedroom doorway, wearing one of Margaret's old nightgowns that Widow Prescott had altered to fit her, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said quietly. "I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, all the people who could get hurt because of choices I made." Elias pulled back the covers in silent invitation, and Clara slipped into bed beside him with the careful movements of someone still learning to trust. They lay facing each other in the darkness, close enough to feel each other's warmth, but not touching beyond the brush of fingers. "Tell me about something good," Clara whispered. "Something that has nothing to do with Hartwell or threats or any of this mess." Elias thought for a moment, then began to tell her about the ranch as it had been in his grandfather's time, the cattle that had grazed in meadows now brown with drought, the creek that had run clear and cold year-round, the sense of abundance and possibility that had drawn his family to this land in the first place. "It could be like that again," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Not exactly the same, but good in its own way. We could build something here that lasts, something worth passing on." "We," Clara repeated softly, and there was wonder in the word. "If you want that. If you think you could be happy here with me for more than just convenience and protection." Clara was quiet for so long that Elias began to worry. He had presumed too much, moved too fast for someone still healing from betrayal and abuse. But when she finally spoke, her voice held a warmth he hadn't heard before. "I think I could be very happy here," she said. I think I already am, in ways I didn't expect to be again." The next morning brought news that would test their growing closeness. Doc Henley arrived just as they were finishing breakfast, his expression grim and his medical bag absent a sign that this was not a social call. "I'm afraid I have disturbing news," he said, accepting the coffee Clara offered but not drinking it. "I received word yesterday from my colleague in Austin. Clayton Hartwell has been making inquiries with state authorities, asking questions about the legality of your marriage and whether it might be considered fraudulent." Clara's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming that the marriage was arranged solely to avoid legal obligations, that there was no genuine romantic attachment or intent to create a real matrimonial union. Under Texas law, such arrangements can be declared invalid if proven." Elias felt the familiar cold anger settling in his chest. What would that mean legally? If a court agreed with his interpretation, the marriage could be annulled. Clara would revert to her unmarried status, making her vulnerable to the original engagement contract and any legal claims Hartwell might pursue. "But that's ridiculous," Clara protested. "The marriage may have begun as a practical arrangement, but it's become genuine. We're building a real life together." "I believe you," Doc Henley said gently, "but proving the authenticity of your feelings to a court that might be sympathetic to Hartwell's financial interests that could be challenging." Elias stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen. The threat to their marriage felt personal in a way that mere financial pressure hadn't. It wasn't just about Clara's safety anymore, it was about their right to choose their own destiny, to build the life they were discovering they both wanted. "There has to be something we can do," he said, "some way to prove that our marriage is legitimate." "Actually, there might be," Doc Henley said, and something in his tone made both of them look at him sharply. "It's not pleasant to discuss, but under the law, a marriage that has been consummatedis, much more difficult to annul than one that exists only on paper." The implication hung in the air between them, and Elias felt heat rise in his cheeks. Clara, however, seemed to consider the suggestion with practical calm. "You're saying that if we became husband and wife in fact as well as name, it would strengthen our legal position?" "Considerably. Especially if there were witnesses to the evidence of a genuine matrimonial relationship." After Doc Henley left, Elias and Clara found themselves sitting in their front room, the weight of his suggestion settling between them. They had been moving slowly, carefully, respecting Clara's need to heal from her experiences with Hartwell. Now they were being pushed to make intimate decisions based on legal strategy rather than natural progression. "I don't want you to feel pressured," Elias said finally. "What we have is good, and it's growing stronger every day. I won't have it tainted by outside forces or legal maneuvering." Clara was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the land they were learning to call home together. "What if it's not just about legal strategy?" she asked finally. "What if it's about claiming the life we want, rather than waiting for the perfect moment to choose it?" The question surprised him with its directness, its implicit acknowledgement that their feelings had evolved beyond mere convenience and protection. "Are you saying you want that you're ready for?" "I'm saying that I've been thinking about it," Clara interrupted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "About what it would mean to truly be your wife. And I'm not as frightened by the idea as I thought I would be." That afternoon, Clara made an announcement that surprised even Elias with its boldness. She had been working in the schoolhouse when several of the town's women came to visit, ostensibly to help with preparations, but actually to offer support and gossip in the way that communities do during times of crisis. "I want you all to know," Clara said, setting down the book she had been organizing, "that my marriage to Elias is not one of convenience. It may have begun that way, but it has become something real and precious to me. Whatever Clayton Hartwell or his representatives might claim, I am Elias Vane's wife in every sense of the word." The statement rippled through the group of women with the efficiency of small-town communication. By evening, everyone in Dust Creek would know that the new Mrs. Dust Vane had publicly claimed her marriage as genuine and lasting. Widow Prescott, never one to be subtle about important matters, smiled approvingly. "About time," she said briskly. Anyone with eyes could see that you two were falling in love, whether you admitted it or not. Now maybe you can stop tiptoeing around each other and start acting like the married couple you are." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Clara came to Elias's room, carrying her pillow and a small satchel containing her nightclothes. She moved with purpose rather than hesitation, her decision clearly made. "If we're going to do this," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "I want it to be because we choose it, not because we're forced into it by outside pressures." "Are you sure?" Elias asked, searching her face for any sign of doubt or fear. "I'm sure about you," Clara replied. "I'm sure about us. The rest we'll figure out as we go." Their wedding night, delayed by weeks of careful courtship and mutual respect, was gentle and patient and full of the tenderness that had been growing between them since that first meeting in the barn. Clara came to him without fear, and Elias received her with a reverence that honored both her courage and the gift of her trust. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Clara traced patterns on Elias's chest with her fingertips. "I never thought I could feel safe with a man again," she said quietly. "Hartwell made me believe that marriage was about power and control, about one person dominating another." "It doesn't have to be that way," Elias replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It can be about partnership, about two people making each other stronger. Is that what we are now? Partners? In every way that matters." The next morning brought validation of their choice, in an unexpected form. Elias was checking the Winchester rifle that had belonged to his father, cleaning and loading it as he had every morning since Thornfield's visit, when he noticed fresh boot prints in the soft earth around their house. Someone had been watching them during the night, close enough to see into their bedroom window, close enough to observe the evidence of their consummated marriage. The violation of their privacy was infuriating, but it also confirmed that their enemies were desperate enough to resort to spying. "Let them watch," Clara said when he told her about the prints. "Let them report back to Hartwell that we are exactly what we claim to be, husband and wife, who choose to stand together." But even as she spoke with defiance, Elias could see the way her eyes checked the windows and doors, the way she positioned herself where she could see potential escape routes. The knowledge that they were being watched had added a new layer of tension to their daily lives. "We need to end this," Elias said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "Not just defend against it, but finish it once and for all." "What did you have in mind?" "It's time to use those papers you took, not just as insurance, but as ammunition. If Hartwell wants to play dirty, maybe it's time we showed him what dirty really looks like." Clara nodded slowly, her hand moving instinctively to touch his arm, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Then let's finish it." The revelation came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by Sheriff Morrison, with the grim efficiency of a man who had learned to bear bad news without sugarcoating it. Clara was in the schoolhouse preparing lessons for the dozen children who had begun attending classes, while Elias worked on winterizing the ranch buildings. The sound of galloping hooves brought them both running. Morrison dismounted heavily, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night and a hard ride from the county seat. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "All of us, now." They gathered in the Vane kitchen, the same room where Clara had first revealed her secrets and where they had made their decision to marry. But the documents Morrison spread across their table made those earlier revelations seem almost simple by comparison. "I've been doing some investigating," Morrison began, his weathered fingers tracing the legal papers before him. "Following up on those business dealings Clara mentioned, trying to understand just how deep Hartwell's corruption runs." He paused, looking directly at Elias with something that might have been sympathy. "Elias, do you remember taking out a loan against the ranch 3 years ago, right after Margaret died?" The question hit Elias like a physical blow. The months after Margaret's death remained hazy in his memory, blurred by grief and whiskey, and the overwhelming task of trying to manage alone what had been built for two. There was something. The funeral expenses, the medical bills. I needed cash to keep things running while I figured out what to do next. "Do you remember who held that loan?" Some bank in Millbrook. I dealt with a representative, never met the actual. Elias stopped, understanding beginning to dawn with horrible clarity. No, that's not possible. Morrison slid a thick folder across the table. Millbrook Farmers and Merchants Bank, owned outright by the Hartwell family for the past 5 years. The loan you took out? It was approved personally by Clayton Hartwell himself. Clara had gone very still, her face pale as she processed the implications. He's owned the ranch all along. Not owned exactly, but controlled. The loan terms were structured to become increasingly difficult to meet. Late fees, compounding interest, clauses that could trigger immediate foreclosure under various circumstances. Elias felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something worse, the sick realization that he had been manipulated, played like a fool while believing himself to be making independent choices. How much do I owe? Morrison consulted the papers. According to the current statement, including accumulated interest and penalties, just over $4,000. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Even if the ranch had been thriving, even if the drought hadn't devastated the land and livestock, $4,000 was more than most Texas ranchers could raise without selling everything they owned. But that's not the worst of it, Morrison continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. I found the original correspondence between Hartwell and his agents. This whole thing, Clara's arranged engagement, her escape, even her finding her way to Dust Creek, none of it was accidental. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. What are you saying? I'm saying that Hartwell knew exactly where you would run. He's been tracking you since the day you left Millbrook, guiding you toward this place, toward Elias specifically. That's impossible, Elias protested. Clara came here by chance. The storm, the barn. The storm was real, Morrison interrupted. But Clara's route here wasn't random. Look at this. He produced a map marked with red ink, showing a trail from Millbrook toward various small towns in the region. Dust Creek was circled, with notations in the margins that made Elias's blood run cold. He had men watching the roads, subtly directing travelers away from certain routes and toward others. Anyone matching Clara's description was gently steered toward Dust Creek specifically. Clara stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen like a caged animal. He wanted me to come here. He wanted me to meet Elias. But why? Morrison's answer came like a hammer blow. Because he knew about the loan. He knew that Elias was vulnerable, that the ranch was hanging by a thread. He engineered the whole situation so that when he finally made his move, he wouldn't just be reclaiming a runaway fiancé head before closing on property that had become connected to you. The marriage, Elias said, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. He knew we'd get married for protection, and a married woman's debts become her husband's responsibility. Exactly. By marrying Clara, you didn't just take on a wife, you took on all the financial obligations that Hartwell claims she owes him. The stolen property, the breach of engagement contract, everything. It's all legally your responsibility now. Clara had stopped pacing and was staring at the papers spread across the table with the expression of someone seeing a trap close around them with perfect, inexorable precision. He played us, she said quietly. Every choice we thought we were making freely, every decision we believed was ours, orchestrated all of it. Not all of it, Elias said firmly, standing to move beside her. He may have set the stage, but what grew between us was real. What we built here together was genuine. Was it? Clara turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. How can we know? How can we trust anything we feel when it all started with his manipulation? Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's more. I'm afraid it gets worse. Both Elias and Clara turned to stare at him, wondering what could possibly be worse than learning that their entire relationship had been orchestrated by the man they were fighting. The town, Morrison said simply. Hartwell doesn't just hold your loan, Elias. He holds paper on half the businesses in Dust Creek. The general store, the boarding house, even the land the schoolhouse sits on, it's all connected to loans and mortgages that trace back to his bank. Which means that if he forecloses on you, he can foreclose on everyone who's supported you. The entire community could be destroyed as punishment for standing against him. The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Elias felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Every person who had welcomed Clara, every neighbor who had stood with them against Hartwell's threats, every family whose children attended Clara's school, they were all at risk because of choices he had made. "There has to be something we can do," Clara said desperately. "Some legal remedy, some way to fight back." Morrison shook his head grimly. "I've consulted with every lawyer I could reach. Hartwell's been careful to stay within the bounds of the law, even if his methods are morally reprehensible. The contracts are legitimate, the debts are real, and the foreclosure procedures are all perfectly legal. What about the papers Clara took, the evidence of his other crimes? Banking fraud is hard to prove, especially when the victims are poor families with no resources to fight back. And Hartwell's lawyers are already claiming that any documents Clara possesses were stolen property, which makes them inadmissible in court." Elias moved to the window, staring out at the land his grandfather had claimed, and his father had improved, and he had nearly lost through grief and neglect. The irony was bitter. Just as he had found reason to hope again, just as he had discovered love and purpose with Clara, everything was being stripped away by forces he couldn't control. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "According to the foreclosure notice, that'll be served tomorrow, 30 days. After that, the property reverts to the bank, and everyone living on it becomes a trespasser." Clara moved to stand beside Elias at the window, her hand finding his arm in the gesture that had become natural between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I brought this down on you, on everyone. If I had stayed in Millbrook, if I had married him like I was supposed to." "No." Elias turned to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face gently. "Don't you dare apologize for refusing to submit to a monster. Don't you dare regret the choices that brought us together. But the ranch, the town, all these innocent people will find a way to survive, just like they always have. But I won't let you sacrifice yourself to a man who sees you as property to be owned." Morrison stood, gathering his papers with the air of a man who had delivered his burden and was ready to escape the weight of it. "I'll keep looking for legal options," he said. "Maybe something will turn up. But you should prepare yourselves for the possibility that fighting this in court might not be enough." After he left, Elias and Clara sat in their kitchen in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what they had learned. The coffee grew cold in their cups, and the afternoon light faded toward evening, but neither seemed inclined to move or speak. Finally, Clara broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of their dilemma. "Do you still want to fight him?" Elias considered the question seriously. Fighting Hartwell now meant risking not just their own future, but the welfare of everyone who had supported them. It meant potentially destroying a community that had shown them nothing but kindness and loyalty. But surrender meant something worse. It meant accepting that wealth and power could simply take whatever they wanted, that good people had no recourse against those willing to manipulate and destroy. It meant letting Clara be dragged back to a life of abuse and control, letting Hartwell's victory encourage other predators to believe they could act with impunity. "Yes," he said finally, "but not the way we've been fighting. If Hartwell wants to play games with manipulation and legal maneuvering, maybe it's time we stopped playing by his rules." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time to remind him that there are some things money can't buy, and some people who won't be controlled no matter what kind of paper he waves at them." Clara studied his face in the gathering darkness, seeing something there that she recognized from their first meeting in the barn, quiet strength of a man who had decided to take a stand, regardless of the cost. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet, but I know one thing. If we're going down fighting, and maybe, if we're smart about it, we can take him down with us." Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter was coming. But inside their kitchen, as Elias and Clara began to plan their counterattack, there was warmth and determination and the unbreakable bond between two people who had found each other against impossible odds and refused to let anyone tear them apart. The community bell that had once called children to school now served a different purposes, summoning the people of Dust Creek to what might be their final stand. Clara stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, her hand on the rope that connected to the brass bell mounted in the small tower above, and felt the weight of everything they were about to risk. 3 days had passed since Sheriff Morrison's devastating revelation. 3 days of careful planning and quiet conversations, and the kind of preparation that men who had survived wars understood instinctively. Elias had spent those days moving through the community like a general preparing for battle, not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with the patient work of ensuring that everyone understood what they faced and what they were choosing. Now, as the bell's clear notes rang out across the drought-scarred landscape, Clara watched people emerge from their homes and businesses with the determined step of those who had made difficult decisions and were prepared to live with the consequences. Doc Henley arrived first, his medical bag replaced by a leather satchel containing documents and correspondence that represented weeks of careful investigation. Widow Prescott came next, walking with the purposeful stride of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and refused to be intimidated by anyone's threats. Henrik Janssen closed his store early, turning the sign and locking the door as if he expected it might be the last time he performed that simple ritual. One by one, they filled the schoolhouse where Clara had hoped to build a future for the community's children. The irony was not lost on any of them. They were gathering in a place meant for learning and growth, to discuss what might be the end of their town as they knew it. Sheriff Morrison arrived last, carrying official papers that confirmed what they all already knew. The foreclosure notices had been served, the legal machinery was in motion, and they had exactly 27 days before Hartwell could claim everything they had worked to build. "Before we begin," Elias said, standing at the front of the room where Clara usually conducted her lessons, "I want everyone to understand that you have choices here. What Clara and I are planning to do it carries risks, and those risks extend to anyone who supports us. If you want to protect your families, your businesses, your futures, now is the time to walk away. No one will think less of you for making that choice." He paused, scanning the faces of people who had become not just neighbors but family over the past months. "But if you stay, if you choose to stand with us, you need to understand that we're not just fighting for the ranch or the school or even this town. We're fighting for the principle that decent people shouldn't be at the mercy of those who use wealth and power to destroy lives for their own amusement." Mrs. Morrison, the sheriff's wife, raised her hand with the tentative gesture of someone unaccustomed to speaking in public meetings. "What exactly are you proposing to do?" she asked. "I mean, what's the plan?" It was Clara who answered, moving to stand beside her husband with the confidence of a woman who had found her strength through adversity. "We're going to give Mr. Hartwell exactly what he wants," she said, and the murmur of confusion that rippled through the room was exactly what she had expected. "We're going to stop running, stop hiding, stop trying to fight him with lawyers and legal maneuvers that favor those with the most money." "I don't understand," Henrik said, frowning. "How does giving him what he wants help us?" "Because what he wants isn't really the ranch, or the money, or even me," Clara continued. "What he wants is to prove that he can take whatever he chooses, that people like us have no power to resist people like him. He wants to make an example of us that will keep others from defying him in the future." Elias picked up the explanation, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had found his purpose. "So we're going to let him come here. We're going to invite him to collect his debts and claim his property in person, in front of the entire community. And when he does, we're going to show him and everyone else exactly what kind of man he really is." Doc Henley leaned forward in his chair, his keen eyes studying both Elias and Clara with the intensity of someone trying to diagnose a complex condition. "That sounds dangerously close to vigilante justice," he said carefully. And while I understand the sentiment, I'm not sure I can support anything that puts innocent people at risk. No vigilante justice, Clara assured him. No violence, no illegal actions. Just the truth, presented in a way that makes it impossible to ignore or suppress. She moved to the desk at the front of the room and retrieved a thick folder that had been hidden there since the meeting began. The papers I took from Hartwell's office, they document more than just fraudulent banking practices. They show a pattern of behavior that extends across multiple states, multiple victims, multiple crimes. But more importantly, they show his methods, his weaknesses, the things he desperately wants to keep hidden. Sheriff Morrison straightened in his chair, his professional interest clearly engaged. What kind of things? Blackmail, Clara said simply. Extortion. The systematic destruction of families and communities for his personal profit. And most damaging of all evidence, that he's been using his bank to launder money for criminal organizations, including cattle rustlers and claim jumpers who have been operating throughout this territory. The silence that followed was profound. These were serious accusations, the kind that could destroy a man's reputation and freedom if proven. But they were also the kind of accusations that could get the accusers killed if they couldn't be substantiated. "Can you prove it?" Morrison asked quietly. "In a court of law, with expensive lawyers and judges who might be sympathetic to Hartwell's interests?" "Probably not," Clara admitted. "But in the court of public opinion, with the right presentation and the right audience, absolutely." Widow Prescott spoke up from her seat near the back of the room, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen enough of human nature to understand its patterns. "You're talking about destroying him the same way he's been destroying others, by exposing his secrets and letting the consequences follow naturally." "Exactly," Elias confirmed. "But we need his cooperation to make it work. We need him here, in person, confident and arrogant, and willing to demonstrate exactly what kind of man he is, in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated." Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith, raised a work-hardened hand. "How do you plan to get him here? Man like that doesn't usually come calling on folks like us." Clara smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded everyone present why she had been brave enough to run from her arranged marriage in the first place. "By offering him something he can't resist, complete victory, we're going to invite him to come collect his debts and claim his property at a public ceremony. We're going to make it sound like a surrender, a community acknowledgement that he was right and we were wrong. And when he comes, he'll find that we've invited some additional guests, newspaper reporters from Austin and Dallas, federal marshals who have been investigating banking irregularities in this region, representatives from other communities where his victims live, an audience that will hear every word he says and witness every action he takes." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Hartwell's arrogance had always been his weakness, his need to be acknowledged as superior, his desire to humiliate those who opposed him, his compulsion to demonstrate his power publicly. By appealing to that arrogance, by making surrender look like victory, they could lure him into exposing himself completely. But it required everyone in the community to play their parts perfectly, to maintain the illusion of defeat while secretly preparing for the moment when truth would be revealed. "It's dangerous," Doc Henley observed. "If something goes wrong, if he suspects what we're really doing, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Elias interrupted, "except that we'll have gone down fighting instead of simply accepting defeat." The discussion continued for 2 hours, with every aspect of the plan examined and debated. Questions were raised about timing, about safety, about what would happen if their gamble failed. But gradually, as the implications became clear, a consensus began to emerge. These were people who had already lost so much to forces beyond their control, to drought and economic hardship, and the casual cruelty of those who saw their suffering as opportunity. They had reached the point where the risk of action seemed preferable to the certainty of surrender. One by one, they committed to the plan. Doc Henley would use his connections with colleagues in other towns to spread word of the ceremony and ensure the right people heard about it. Sheriff Morrison would reach out to federal authorities who had been investigating banking fraud in the territory. Widow Prescott would handle the logistics of hosting what needed to appear to be a community celebration of Hartwell's victory. As the meeting broke up and people began to drift back to their homes and businesses, Clara found herself standing alone in the schoolhouse with Elias, surrounded by the evidence of dreams that might soon be destroyed. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked quietly. "Asking all these people to risk everything for our fight?" Elias moved to the window that looked out over the town they had both come to love, watching their neighbors return to their evening routines with the weight of momentous decisions on their shoulders. "I think we're giving them the chance to choose their own destiny instead of having it chosen for them," he said finally. "That's all anyone can ask, for the right to stand up for what they believe in, even when the odds are against them." Clara joined him at the window, her hand finding his, with the naturalness that had developed between them over months of shared struggle and growing love. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not running away from Hartwell, not ending up in your barn, not marrying you. Even if we lose everything, I'll always be grateful for the chance to love and be loved freely." Elias turned to face her, seeing in her expression the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt in his own heart. "We're not going to lose everything," he said with quiet conviction. "We might lose the ranch, the school, even the town as we know it. But we won't lose each other, and we won't lose the knowledge that we stood up for what was right when it mattered." Outside, the October wind carried the first real chill of approaching winter, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its loneliness to the darkening sky. But inside the schoolhouse, surrounded by books and dreams and the evidence of human determination to learn and grow despite adversity, Clara and Elias held each other close and prepared for the battle that would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone they had come to call family. The invitation to Clayton Hartwell would be sent the next morning, written in Clara's elegant script and signed by both of Thema formal surrender that was actually a declaration of war. And then they would wait and prepare and trust that truth and justice still meant something in a world that too often seemed to reward only wealth and power. The bell tower above them caught the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment the brass gleamed like gold against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness, a promise that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The wedding dress had been Clara's idea, stroke of symbolic genius that no one fully understood until they saw her wearing it on the morning of Hartwell's arrival. It was the same white cotton dress the community women had sewn for her wedding to Elias, carefully preserved and altered once more, this time with black ribbon threaded through the bodice and sleeves. She stood in their bedroom, adjusting the veil that Sarah Henley had contributed from her family's collection, while Elias watched from the doorway with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You look like a bride going to her own funeral," he observed quietly. "That's exactly the impression I want to give," Clara replied, turning to face him. "Hartwell expects to see a broken woman, someone who has finally accepted defeat. This dress tells that story while hiding the truth underneath." The truth was that Clara had never looked stronger or more determined. The months of marriage to Elias, the support of the community, the purpose she had found in teaching all of it had transformed her from the frightened woman who had fled her engagement into someone capable of facing her tormentor with dignity and courage. "The reporters arrived an hour ago," Elias told her. "Morrison put them up at the boarding house and told them the ceremony doesn't start until noon. That gives us time to make sure everyone knows their roles." They had spent the past 2 weeks in careful preparation, choreographing every detail of what needed to appear to be a community's surrender to superior forces. The actual ceremony would take place in the main street of Dust Creek, with a platform constructed for the occasion and chairs arranged for the witnesses Hartwell would expect to see defeated townspeople acknowledging his victory. What he wouldn't immediately notice were the additional observers scattered throughout the crowd, the newspaper reporters from Austin and Dallas who had been told they were witnessing a unique legal settlement, the federal marshals who believed they were attending a routine property transfer, the representatives from other communities who had been invited to witness the proper resolution of a difficult situation. Clara picked up her leather satchel, the same one that had carried her most precious possessions when she first arrived in Dust Creek. Now it contained something even more valuable, copies of all the documents she had taken from Hartwell's office, organized and annotated to tell the complete story of his crimes. "Are you ready for this?" Elias asked, offering her his arm with the same gentle courtesy he had shown since their first meeting. "I've been ready since the day I ran away from him," Clara replied. "I just didn't know it then." The main street of Dust Creek had been transformed for the occasion. Bunting and ribbons decorated the buildings not in celebration, but in the kind of forced festivity that conquered peoples might display for their conquerors. The platform at the center of town was draped in white cloth, with a table and chairs arranged for the signing of documents that would transfer ownership of the various properties. Clayton Hartwell arrived precisely at noon, stepping down from an expensive carriage with the satisfied air of a man collecting a well-deserved prize. He was handsome in the way that wealth and privilege could make a man handsome, well-dressed, well-fed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to take whatever he wanted. Behind him came his entourage. Theodore Blackwood, the lawyer Clara remembered from his earlier visit, 2 additional attorneys whose expensive suits marked them as specialists in complex financial matters, and 4 men who were obviously guards, though they maintained the pretense of being simple employees. "Mrs. Vane," Hartwell said, approaching the platform where Clara waited with Elias beside her. "How lovely to see you again, and wearing white, how appropriate for a woman returning to her proper station." His voice carried the smooth charm that had initially fooled Clara's father into trusting him, but underneath it was the cold certainty of a predator who believed his prey was finally cornered. "Mr. Hartwell," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the fear that seeing him again awakened. "Thank you for coming. We thought it was important to handle this matter with proper ceremony." "Indeed. The return of stolen property and the resolution of outstanding debts should be witnessed by the community that has harbored a fugitive. It will serve as an excellent example for others who might be tempted to defy legitimate authority." Elias stepped forward slightly, not threateningly, but enough to remind Hartwell that Clara was not alone and unprotected. "My wife and I are prepared to meet our obligations," he said carefully. "We ask only that the proceedings be conducted with dignity and respect for all involved." Hartwell's smile was pure predatory satisfaction. "Of course. I'm not an unreasonable man, Mr. Vane. I take no pleasure in the misfortunes that have brought us to this point. But contracts must be honored, debts must be paid, and order must be maintained." Sheriff Morrison approached the platform carrying a leather portfolio containing the legal documents that would formalize the property transfers. His expression was appropriately grim, that of a lawman forced to oversee proceedings he personally found distasteful but legally unavoidable. "If everyone is ready," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "we can begin the formal proceedings." The ceremony that followed was a masterpiece of theater. One by one, the documents were read aloud: the mortgage on Elias's ranch, the debts owed by various townspeople, the legal obligations that Clara's marriage had supposedly transferred to her husband. Hartwell listened with obvious satisfaction as each paper was presented, signed, and witnessed according to proper legal procedure. "Now," he said when the financial matters had been concluded, "we come to the matter of personal property that was unlawfully removed from my custody." He gestured to Clara with the casual authority of someone reclaiming a misplaced possession. "Mrs. Vane, I believe you have certain documents and personal items that belong to me. I trust you're prepared to return them now that this unfortunate episode is concluded." This was the moment Clara had been preparing for, the crucial point where everything would either succeed or fail catastrophically. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a thick folder, holding it where everyone present could see it clearly. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying further than it should have, reaching every person in the crowd as well as the reporters who were carefully noting every word. "I do have documents that originally came from your office, Mr. Hartwell. documents that I believe the public has a right to examine." Instead of handing the folder to Hartwell, she opened it and began to read from the papers inside. A letter dated March 15th, 1883, from Clayton Hartwell to his associate Marcus Brennan, regarding the manipulation of loan terms to force foreclosure on the Peterson family farm. "That's enough," Hartwell interrupted, his smooth demeanor cracking slightly. "Those documents are private correspondence, stolen property that must be returned immediately. A banking record showing the systematic overvaluation of collateral in order to justify loans that borrowers could never repay." "Sheriff Morrison," Hartwell snapped, "I demand that you stop this woman from publicly reading stolen private documents." But Clara continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. Correspondence with known cattle rustlers, arranging for the purchase of stolen livestock through fraudulent bills of sale. "Stop her," Hartwell shouted, abandoning all pretense of civilized conduct. "Those documents were obtained illegally and contain confidential business information." It was exactly the reaction Clara had hoped for. In his anger and desperation to stop the revelations, Hartwell was confirming the authenticity and damaging nature of the documents more effectively than any legal proceeding could have done. The federal marshals, who had been observing the proceedings with professional interest, began to move closer to the platform. The newspaper reporters were scribbling furiously, capturing not just Clara's revelations, but Hartwell's increasingly desperate attempts to silence her. Evidence of systematic banking fraud spanning 4 states and involving the illegal seizure of properties through manipulated debt structures. Hartwell lunged toward Clara, but Elias stepped smoothly between them, his imposing physical presence serving as an effective barrier. "I think that's enough, Mr. Hartwell," Elias said quietly, but his voice carried a note of controlled menace that made the banker's guards shift nervously. "My wife is simply returning your property to its rightful owners, the people you've been stealing from." "This is outrageous," Hartwell sputtered, his carefully constructed facade completely abandoned now. "I came here in good faith to resolve a legal matter, and instead I'm subjected to this public lynching based on fabricated evidence." "Fabricated?" Clara asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Then you won't mind if these documents are examined by proper authorities to verify their authenticity." She handed the folder to one of the federal marshals, who accepted it with the grim satisfaction of a lawman who had been investigating similar irregularities and finally found the proof he needed. "Mr. Hartwell," the marshal said formally, "I'm Federal Marshal James Crawford. I think we need to have a conversation about your banking practices and some irregularities that have come to our attention in several jurisdictions." The transformation in Hartwell was complete. The smooth, confident predator had been replaced by a cornered animal, dangerous in his desperation but no longer in control of the situation. "This is a setup," he said, looking around the crowd with growing panic. "A conspiracy to destroy me using forged documents and false accusations." "The documents came from your own office," Clara said simply. "Your own handwriting, your own signature, your own records of crimes you committed against innocent families." Widow Prescott stood up from her place in the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to recognize justice when she saw it. "Mr. Hartwell," she said clearly, "you came here expecting to destroy our community and drag this woman back to a life of abuse and control. Instead, you've exposed yourself as the criminal you've always been. I'd say that's what people call poetic justice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Hartwell seemed to realize for the first time that he was surrounded by people who no longer feared him, who had seen his true nature revealed and found him wanting. The carefully planned ceremony had become something else entirely, not a surrender, but a reckoning. And as the federal marshals began to take a more active interest in the proceedings, as the newspaper reporters continued to document every word and gesture, as the representatives from other communities began to understand the significance of what they were witnessing, Clayton Hartwell finally understood that his long reign of terror was coming to an end. The moment when everything changed came not with violence or drama, but with the quiet authority of Federal Marshal Crawford examining the blood-stained handkerchief Clara pressed to a cut on Elias's forehead. Hartwell's guards had finally moved to protect their employer, and in the scuffle that followed, one of them had struck Elias with the butt of his pistol. Clara knelt beside her husband on the platform, using the delicate handkerchief from her wedding outfit to tend his wound while the crowd around them erupted in outrage. The sight of their gentle giant cowboy being attacked for defending his wife transformed whatever remaining sympathy anyone might have felt for Hartwell into cold fury. "That's enough," Doc Henley announced, pushing through the crowd with his medical bag. "I don't care what legal authority you think you have, Mr. Hartwell, you don't have the right to assault decent people." But Hartwell was beyond rational thought now, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him with each passing moment. The documents Clara had revealed were being examined by multiple authorities. The newspaper reporters were documenting his increasingly erratic behavior, and the crowd that had gathered to witness his triumph was instead watching his destruction. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled at Clara, his handsome features twisted with rage and desperation. "No idea of the consequences you've brought down on yourselves and this pathetic excuse for a town." Marshal Crawford stepped forward, his badge clearly visible and his hand resting on his weapon. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm placing you under federal custody, pending investigation into charges of banking, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Your men can step aside now, or they can join you in federal prison." Two of Hartwell's guards immediately raised their hands and moved away from their employer, recognizing the futility of resisting federal authority. But the other two seemed prepared to fight, their hands moving toward their weapons with the desperation of men who knew their fate was tied to their employers. It was Sheriff Morrison who prevented bloodshed, drawing his own weapon with the practiced speed of a veteran lawman. "Gentlemen," he said conversationally, "I've been sheriff in this territory for 15 years, and I've never had to clean up after a gunfight in my town square. I'd prefer not to start today. So why don't you follow your friend's example and step away from Mr. Hartwell before this gets any more unpleasant?" The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then, one of the remaining guards holstered his weapon and raised his hands, and the other reluctantly followed suit. Clara helped Elias to his feet, checking his wound with the careful attention of someone who had learned to recognize when injuries were serious. The cut was bloody but shallow, more frightening than dangerous, though it served to crystallize the community's anger at seeing their protector attacked. "I'm all right," Elias assured her, though his voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "But I think it's time Mr. Hartwell learned what happens when people stop being afraid of him." Widow Prescott had produced a pitcher of water and clean cloths from somewhere, approaching the platform with the practical efficiency of a woman who had dealt with injuries and emergencies throughout her long life. "Here," she said, taking the bloody handkerchief from Clara and replacing it with a proper bandage. "That handkerchief's too precious to waste on his blood. You keep that for better memories." As Doc Henley cleaned and bandaged Elias's wound, Marshal Crawford continued his examination of the documents Clara had provided. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read through the evidence of systematic fraud and corruption. "Mrs. Vane," he said formally, "these documents appear to detail criminal activities spanning multiple states and involving substantial sums of money. I'll need you to provide a formal statement about how you obtained them and what you witnessed during your time in Mr. Hartwell's household." "I'll be happy to cooperate fully with your investigation," Clara replied. "But I want to make something clear to everyone. Present, I'm not seeking revenge against Mr. Hartwell. I'm seeking justice for all the families he's destroyed, all the communities he's manipulated, all the lives he's ruined for his own profit." Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith, spoke up from his place in the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had worked hard all his life and understood the value of honest labor. "What about our debts, the mortgages and loans he holds on half the town?" Marshal Crawford consulted the documents again, conferring quietly with his partner before responding. "If these records are accurate, And if our investigation confirms what they appear to show, then many of those debts were created through fraudulent practices. Banks that engage in systematic fraud can have their actions reversed by federal court order. A murmur of hope rippled through the crowd, the possibility that their community might be saved, that the sentences Hartwell had imposed on them might be lifted, that they might actually have a future worth fighting for. But Hartwell wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, he made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "Even if you destroy me," he said, his voice carrying across the square with the intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose, "you'll never be free of what I've created. The debts, the legal obligations, the dependencies I've built into this entire region, they'll outlast me. You think you've won, but all you've done is ensure that when I fall, I'll take all of you with me." It was Clara who answered him, rising from where she knelt beside Elias and facing her former tormentor with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through months of fear and struggle. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent square, "you've spent so much time thinking of people as property to be owned that you've forgotten something important. Communities aren't built on debt and dependency, they're built on mutual support and shared purpose. You can destroy the legal structures you've created, but you can't destroy the bonds between people who choose to stand together." She gestured toward the crowd around them, farmers and shopkeepers, widows and working families, children and elderly people who had all chosen to risk everything for the principle that right should triumph over might. "Look around you. These people didn't come here today because they owed you money or because they were afraid of your power. They came because they believe in something you'll never understand, the idea that communities can choose their own destiny when they work together." Hartwell's response was a bitter laugh that held no humor whatsoever. How poetic, how noble, how utterly naive. Let's see how noble you feel when federal investigators start examining every business deal, every loan, every transaction that's kept this miserable town alive for the past 5 years. You think I'm the only one with secrets? You think everyone here has clean hands? Marshal Crawford stepped forward again, his expression stern but not unsympathetic. "Mr. Hartwell, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. Anything else you say will be used against you in federal court." As the marshals placed Hartwell in custody, preparing to transport him to the territorial capital for formal charges, Clara found herself standing in the middle of the platform, surrounded by the community that had chosen to support her and Elias despite the risks. The ceremony that was supposed to have marked their defeat had instead become something unprecedented, a public reckoning that had exposed corruption and brought hope where there had been despair. But even as they watched Hartwell being led away in chains, Clara and Elias both understood that the real work was just beginning. The legal battles would take months or years to resolve. The economic damage would take time to repair. The trust that had been broken would need to be rebuilt brick by brick. "What happens now?" young Tommy Prescott asked, appearing at Clara's elbow with the wide-eyed curiosity of a 10-year-old who had just witnessed history in the making. Clara looked down at the boy who would be one of her students when the school reopened, then looked out over the crowd of people who had become her family and her community. "Now we go back to work," she said simply. "We rebuild what needs rebuilding, we heal what needs healing, and we make sure this kind of thing never happens again." Elias moved to stand beside her, his bandaged head a reminder of the price they had paid for this victory, but his eyes bright with the hope that had sustained them through their darkest moments. "Together," he added, taking Clara's hand in his own, "we do it together." The crowd began to disperse gradually, people drifting back to their homes and businesses with the slightly dazed expression of those who had witnessed something extraordinary. But they moved differently now, with their heads held higher, their steps more confident, their voices carrying the strength that came from knowing they had faced their worst fears and emerged victorious. As the sun began to set over Dust Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara and Elias stood together on the platform where they had risked everything for the chance to live freely. The blood-stained handkerchief was carefully folded in Clara's pocket, not as a memento of violence, but as a reminder that love and courage could transform even the darkest moments into something precious and lasting. 6 months later, the sound of children's laughter echoed from the new schoolhouse as Clara rang the brass bell that had once summoned the community to what they feared might be their final stand. Now it called students to lessons, neighbors to celebrations, and visitors to witness the remarkable transformation of a town that had refused to surrender its future to the greed of one man. The schoolhouse itself stood as a testament to what communities could accomplish when they worked together. Built with lumber donated by farmers, labor contributed by townspeople, and careful planning that made every dollar stretch as far as possible, it was larger and better equipped than the original building. More importantly, it served students from 3 neighboring communities, drawing families who had heard about the quality of education available in Dust Creek. Clara stood in the doorway of her classroom, watching her pupils work through their arithmetic problems with the focused concentration that came from knowing their education was precious and hard-won. The class included 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, and among them was young Tommy Prescott, whose questions had prompted some of her most inspired teaching moments. "Mrs. Vane," called out Sarah Patterson, a bright-eyed 12-year-old, whose family had moved to Dust Creek specifically for the school. "When you rang the bell that day, when all those important people came, did you know everything was going to work out the way it did?" Clara considered the question seriously, as she did all inquiries from her students. She had learned that children deserved honest answers to their important questions, even when those answers were complicated. "No, Sarah, I didn't know how it would work out. Your husband and I knew we had to try to do what was right, even if we weren't sure we could succeed. Sometimes that's all you can do, stand up for what you believe in and hope that other good people will stand with you." "And they did," added Marcus Henley, Doc Henley's grandson, who had been present during those tense days and remembered them with the clarity that children brought to dramatic events. "Yes, they did. And that's something you should remember as you grow up and face your own difficult choices. Communities are strongest when people choose to support each other, especially during hard times." Through the large windows of the schoolhouse, Clara could see the evidence of Dust Creek's revival. New families had arrived throughout the spring and summer, drawn by reports of good land available at fair prices and a community that welcomed newcomers. The general store had expanded, adding new inventory and serving customers from a much wider area. Tom Fletcher's blacksmith shop had hired an apprentice to handle the increased business. Most significantly, the creek that gave the town its name was flowing again. The previous winter had brought heavy snows to the mountains, and spring melt had restored the water that drought had stolen. Elias's cattle grazed in meadows that were green for the first time in years, and the vegetable garden behind their house produced more than they could consume, allowing Clara to share fresh produce with neighbors and students. The legal resolution of Hartwell's crimes had taken months to work through the federal court system, but the outcome had exceeded their most optimistic hopes. Not only had his fraudulent loans been declared void, but the federal government had seized his assets to compensate victims throughout the territory. Many families had received enough restitution to rebuild their lives, and several communities had been able to purchase their own land rather than remaining dependent on distant creditors. Hartwell himself had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, though rumors suggested his health was declining rapidly under the stress of incarceration. Clara felt no satisfaction in his suffering revenge. Had never been her goal, but she did feel relief that his ability to harm others had been permanently ended. As the school day concluded and children began dispersing to their homes, Clara gathered her materials and prepared for the walk back to the ranch. The routine had become precious to her transition from teacher to wife, from public responsibility to private happiness, from the challenges of education to the rewards of partnership. Elias was waiting for her at the gate of their property, as he had taken to doing when his work allowed. At 46, he looked younger and healthier than he had during their first meeting in the barn. The lines of grief and isolation had been replaced by the weathering that came from honest work, shared with someone who made the burdens lighter and the rewards sweeter. "Good day," he asked, taking her school satchel and offering her his arm for the walk to their house. "Very good. We finished the unit on practical mathematics, calculating feed requirements, measuring land, working with percentages for business transactions. Things they'll actually need to know." "And the older students?" "Reading Shakespeare. The Tempest. They're fascinated by the idea of forgiveness and redemption, of people getting second chances to become better than they were." Elias smiled at that, understanding the parallels she was drawing. They had both been given second chances to love again after loss, she to live freely after oppression. Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but had grown into something deeper and more sustaining than either had thought possible. Their house showed the evidence of a partnership that extended beyond survival into prosperity. The rooms that had once been repositories for grief and neglect now reflected the care of people who had created a true home together. Margaret's presence was still honored. Her photograph remained on the mantelpiece. Her garden had been restored and expanded, but it no longer dominated the space. Instead, it had been integrated into a larger story of healing and growth. "I have news," Elias said, as they settled onto their front porch with the coffee that remained their sacred evening ritual. "Doc Henley stopped by this afternoon. He's heard from his colleague in Austin there's going to be a formal investigation into banking practices throughout the territory. They want to use our experience as a model for how communities can protect themselves from predatory lending." Clara felt a mixture of pride and concern at the news. She was glad their struggle could help others, but she had no desire to relive those difficult months or to become a public symbol of resistance. What would that involve? Testimony, mostly. Explaining what we discovered, how we organized the community response, what lessons other places might learn from our experience. "And you think we should do it?" Elias was quiet for a moment, watching the sun set over land that now truly belonged to them, not just legally, but in the deeper sense of people who had fought for it and earned the right to call it home. "I think we owe it to the families who are still fighting similar battles. But I also think we've earned the right to choose our own level of involvement. We don't have to become crusaders if that's not what we want." Clara considered this, weighing their obligation to help others against their desire to simply live the quiet life they had built together. "I'll do the testimony," she said finally, "once, to help establish the legal precedents and document what we learned. But after that, I want to focus on our life here, our students, our community." "Our family?" Elias asked gently, his hand moving to rest on Clara's still, flat stomach. The pregnancy was barely 3 months along, confirmed by Doc Henley just the week before, but suspected by Clara for much longer. They had shared the news with no one else yet, savoring the private joy of knowing they would soon add another person to their household. "Our family," Clara confirmed, her hand covering his. "I want this child to grow up in a place where people take care of each other, where education is valued, where communities stand together against those who would exploit them. They will. We've built something here that will last long beyond us." As if to prove his point, the sound of voices carried across the evening air, their neighbors calling good night to each other, children being summoned home for supper. The ordinary sounds of a community that had learned to thrive rather than merely survive. The harvest celebration was scheduled for the following weekend, bringing together families from throughout the region to share food, music, and the satisfaction of successful crops after years of struggle. It would be held on the same platform where Hartwell had expected to claim his victory, transformed now into a gathering place for joy rather than confrontation. Clara and Elias would host the event together, their marriage serving as a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition, when love proved stronger than fear, when communities refused to let their future be dictated by those who saw them only as sources of profit. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked, referring to the storm that had first brought her to Elias's barn. "About how different everything might have been if I had chosen a different direction, or if you had decided not to offer me shelter. Sometimes, Elias admitted. But then I remember what you told me about believing in choices rather than fate. We made good choices, Clara. We chose to trust each other, to fight for what mattered, to build something worthy of the sacrifices people made to support us. And we're still choosing, Clara added, her hand moving to her stomach where their child was growing. Every day, we choose what kind of life we want, what kind of community we want to be part of, what kind of future we want to create. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first tentative conversations and their wedding ceremony and their desperate gamble to expose Hartwell's crimes. Now they looked down on a couple who had found not just love, but purpose and place, and the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had made a difference. As they prepared to go inside, Clara paused to look back at the schoolhouse, its windows glowing with lamplight, as Tom Fletcher finished some repair work in preparation for the next day's classes. The building represented more than education. It represented hope, community investment in the future, the belief that knowledge and wisdom could be passed from one generation to the next. "Thank you," she said quietly, though whether she was speaking to Elias, to the community that had supported them, or to whatever forces had guided her to this place and this life, even she wasn't entirely sure. For what? For showing me that running away from something bad could lead to finding something wonderful, for proving that sometimes the barn you choose for shelter turns out to be the beginning of home. Elias pulled her close, and they stood together in the doorway of the house they had made into a sanctuary, looking out over the land they had fought to keep and the community they had helped to save. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to teach, new crops to tend, new choices to make about their shared future. But tonight, it was enough to be here together, surrounded by the evidence of what love and courage could accomplish when supported by people who believed that everyone deserved the chance to write their own story.